Hello everyone. If you've tuned in for Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution's Ocean Encounters presentation, Ocean Plastics, how harmful are they and how do we know? You're in the right place. Coming up, we'll hear from WHOI ocean toxicologist John STEGEMAN, oceanographer Cara Lavender Law, and Sarah DUNLOP, head of plastics and human health at the Minderoo Foundation. Hi everyone. In just a few minutes, we'll get started with Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution's Ocean Plastics. How harmful are they and how do we know? We've still got a lot of people joining us, so thank you for your patience. Hello, you've joined Ocean Plastics. How harmful are they and how do we know? A Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution Ocean Encounters presentation. We have a lot of people joining us tonight, so please bear with us. We'll get started very shortly.
The ocean covers 70% of the globe. It gives us oxygen and food and millions of jobs. It brings joy and shapes our climate and weather. The ocean is life, and it belongs to everyone. Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution is the world's independent leader in ocean discovery, exploration, and education, working to understand and sustain one of humanity's most precious common resources. Join us today for our ocean, our planet, and our future.
Welcome everyone to Ocean Encounters, a series from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, or WHOI as we like to call it for short. Tonight's event is Ocean Plastics. How harmful are they and how do we know? My name is VERONIQUE LACAPRA and I'll be your host for tonight. WHOI's Ocean Encounters events are made possible in part by the Avatar Alliance Foundation and Dalio Philanthropies. Thank you. Our 5th season of Ocean Encounters is also an endorsed activity of the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. Before we hear from our panelists, I'd like to take just a minute and share some tips on how you can optimize your experience with us on Zoom. Throughout the evening, our panelists will be taking questions from all of you in the audience. If you'd like to participate in this live Q&A, please use the Q&A button on your Zoom screen and type your question in the window that appears. You might be more familiar with the chat function in Zoom, but for tonight, please use the Q&A function instead. We often get hundreds of questions, so I apologize if we don't get to yours while we're live. You can ask a question anytime, starting now. I also want to let you know that we are recording this event and that recording will be made available on the whoi.edu website. We had about 2,200 people pre-register to join us tonight, so you are in very good company. We also have people joining us right now on Facebook and on YouTube. Thank you and welcome to everyone. I want to start tonight with a quote. Plastics have conveyed great benefits to humanity and made possible some of the most significant advances of modern civilization in fields as diverse as medicine, electronics, aerospace, construction, food packaging, and sports. It is now clear, however, that plastics are also responsible for significant harms to human health, the economy, and the Earth's environment. That quote is from a report released just last month by the Minderoo Monaco Commission on Plastics and Human Health. The commission was led by scientists at the Minderoo Foundation, a major philanthropic organization based in Australia, as well as the Centre Scientifique de Monaco and Boston College. The report was authored by leading researchers from the fields of healthcare, ocean science, and social science, and 3 of those report authors are here with us tonight to talk about plastics and the findings of this groundbreaking report. They are John Stegeman, Cara Lavender Law, and Sarah Dunlop, who will be joining us from the wilds of Scotland and just via audio, so we won't have her video tonight. John is an ocean toxicologist at WHOI. Cara is an oceanographer at the Sea Education Association, which is one of WHOI's neighbors in Woods Hole. And Sarah is the head of plastics and human health at Minderoo Foundation. Welcome, everybody. You can go ahead and unmute everyone. Let's start with having each of you briefly introduce yourself and tell us your area of scientific expertise and also your role in the report. Sarah, let's start with you.
Thank you, Veronique. I'm a scientist, a neuroscientist, and I was recruited to the Minderoo Foundation in 2020 to set up the Plastics and Human Health Research Program. And we know there's a great deal of concern about plastic in the environment, but although there's a lot of scientific information about human health, it's just not widely known, and we really needed to pull it together. So together with Boston College, Centre Scientifique de Monaco, and Woods Hole, we created an international author team, and I was involved in writing the report.
All right, and we'll be talking more about that report tonight. John, why don't you go next?
Well, thank you very much, Veronique. It's great to be here with you. So I'm a biochemist by training and by research experience and a toxicologist, and I've served WHOI in many capacities over the years, currently as director of the Woods Hole Center for Oceans and Human Health, which is jointly funded by the National Science Foundation and NIH. My own research addresses the mechanisms, that is the biochemistry and molecular biology, by which chemicals are able to affect animals. As far as the report is concerned, my great colleague, Mark Hahn, and I co-led the writing of the ocean section of the report, and Cara Lavender Law, who's on the call with us, as well as MIT WHOI Joint Program student Jordan Pitt and WHOI postdoc Brian James contributed to the ocean section, as did others from around the world. It was a team effort, and it was a great team.
All right, and Cara, with that introduction, go ahead.
Great. Well, thanks, Veronique. It's a great pleasure to be here today with you and with all of you who are watching this evening. I'm here representing the faculty at Sea Education Association, and I'm also a guest investigator at WHOI. I'm trained as a physical oceanographer, but I have been studying ocean plastics at SEA for more than 15 years, starting with data collected by thousands of our undergraduate students in our Sea Semester program. My research really started trying to understand the distribution and transport of plastics in the ocean, and then expanded to look at the sources, their fate, and most recently into solutions to the global problem. And as John said, I was fortunate to contribute to the chapter on plastics and ocean health in the report.
All right, and we'll dig into that report and the Commission's findings in just a few minutes. But I'd kind of like to start with the basics. So, Sarah, I'm going to go to you to tell us, what is plastic?
Okay, well, plastic is an amazing man-made material. It was first made in the 1950s, and about 99% of it is made from fossil fuels, so that's coal, gas, and oil. And back in 2014, about 5% of our fossil fuel went into making plastic, and this is predicted to increase, about a 20% use of fossil fuel to make plastic by 2050. So production is going up. And what happens is that the fossil fuel is actually used to make the carbon-based petrochemical starting materials. And plastic actually turns out to be really complex. There's about 10,500 chemicals that are actually used to make it. We think of it as a very simple substance, but it's not. And so small molecules called monomers are actually strung together. You can see them on the diagram here to make repeating units of plastic polymers. Now, those polymers on their own are absolutely useless. So we need other chemicals which are added, and you can see those interleaved in between. So, for example, plasticizers, which make plastic flexible. Flame retardants are really important because it is, after all, a fossil fuel and highly flammable. And we also add chemical stabilizers to stop it breaking down in UV and light and as a result of heat. So it makes it last much longer. And the end result, of course, is a vast array of plastic products, which has become very much part of our lives.
The number went by kind of fast. How many chemicals did you say went into making plastics?
Okay, there's an amazing paper called A Deep Dive by one of the co-authors who's based in Switzerland. It's about 10,500, and wow. It's not just the additives, but that includes the monomers that I've mentioned, like vinyl chloride, for example, and styrene, and BPA, which you will have heard of. Bisphenol A is also a monomer. Right. And then there are all the catalysts and the processing agents and the fillers and the such like, which go up to make this product.
Okay, and we'll talk more about those chemicals in a little while, but how much plastic is actually out there in the world right now?
Well, a lot, Veronique, and the numbers are quite staggering. So between 1950, when it first started being made, and 2015, about 8 billion metric tons of plastic were made. That's about 1 ton for every person on the planet, and a ton is the weight equivalent to about a small car. And one of the problems is that by 2015, about 6 billion of those 8 billion metric tons were no longer being used, and very little being recycled. So much of it has ended up as waste. And the other issue is that plastic production is accelerating. So about half, there's half of the 8 billion, 4 billion metric tons were manufactured in the last 20 years alone. Wow. And by 2050, we predict that there'll be about, we'll have made 34 billion metric tons. A billion metric tons is 1 gigaton. And to give you an idea of the size of the gigaton, 1 gigaton is equivalent to 10,000 fully laden US aircraft carriers. So that's a lot of plastic. And of course, that increased production will come with an increased amount of waste.
Those numbers are really are staggering. John, of all that plastic, do we know how much is ending up in the ocean?
Well, Veronique, the short answer is no. We don't know. And there are reasons why, partly having to do with how one determines what is in the ocean and what is getting into the ocean on an annual basis. But since the first detection of plastic particles in the open ocean, which was in 1972 by Ed Carpenter, who was at WHOI at the time, there have been a lot of people trying to estimate and measure what is going into the ocean and what in fact is already in the ocean. And these estimates have a lot of uncertainty, as I'm sure Kara will attest, since she's been involved in trying to do those studies. The estimates have the uncertainty, but nevertheless, in 2010, a very careful estimate was that the amount of plastic waste entering the ocean was in the order of 5 to 13, in that range, million megatons. So 5 to 13, maybe 6 to 14 regular tons of plastic entering the ocean every year. And the ranges go up to 20 million megatons per year. So regardless of the uncertainty, however, it's abundantly clear that there are millions and millions of tons of plastics entering the ocean every year, and perhaps hundreds of millions of tons of plastics currently in the ocean. So while we don't know really how much, it's very clear that there is a lot.
Yeah, so again, huge numbers. Kara, do we know where the main source or what the main sources of those plastics are that are getting into the ocean?
Well, we definitely know some of the major sources, but I think part of the reason it's so challenging to get a number, like John was describing, is that there are many diffuse sources. So we know one major source is simply plastic waste that we all generate in our daily lives on land that can escape into the marine environment through by beaches or through rivers, or through stormwater or wastewater outflows, like you can see in this particularly shocking picture. We also know that there can be plastic gear lost from fishing activities or aquaculture activities, and that's often accidentally lost and can, of course, have dire consequences if it gets entangled in corals like you see here. We know that material of all types can enter the ocean from natural disasters, things like tsunamis and hurricanes and floods. And that, of course, includes all of the plastics that we use in our daily lives. We know that plastics enter the ocean from other maritime activities, things like a shipping container that gets lost, and you hear these reports of sneakers or bath toys washing up on coasts around the world when that happens.
In fact, we had an Ocean Encounters all about an incident with nurdles getting into the ocean. So
that's right. So nurdles, which are the sort of raw material of our plastics products, those are those plastic resin pellets that get formed into things that we use every day. Excellent picture shown here. Those can spill into the environment during transport, during those shipping accidents, like I just mentioned. And the nurdles are a form of microplastics, and actually microplastics can be much, much smaller than these that you can see easily by eye, and they can be small enough that they can be deposited into the ocean even from the atmosphere.
Wow. So once all this plastic is actually in the ocean, so we've all heard of the great, or maybe not all of us, but most of us have heard of or seen photos of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, for example. Is that where most of the ocean plastics are, in big, concentrations like that at the surface?
So yes and no. So yeah, we definitely have heard about garbage patches, and these are real accumulations of floating plastic in the ocean. But let me first say, not all plastic floats. So when a plastic item enters the ocean, it will initially float or sink depending on the type of plastic that it's made of and also its size. And when we do have plastics that float, many of them will accumulate in regions of the open ocean referred to as garbage patches, but probably not in the way that many of us kind of tend to visualize that. It's not a sort of large floating garbage heap with recognizable items like bottles or bags and flip-flops. But instead, when we measure plastics in the ocean, the way that we've done this for decades is not necessarily the way you would design it from scratch, but we tow nets designed to collect plankton at the sea surface. And here you see one of these nets being towed at the sea surface.
Little tiny animals and plants in the ocean.
That's right. The very base of the food web. Many of these animals really are microscopic in size. So the mesh of the net is very fine. And when we tow that net and we bring the contents back on board a ship, we pour it into a sieve. And then you look through the sieve to pick out what might be living matter versus plastics. And in some instances like this one you see here, this is a sample where the plastics have now been picked out by eye. And they're very obvious because they're brightly colored and irregularly shaped and sort of hard textures. So these are microplastics. Some of these are a little bigger than microplastics, but what you could see is that they're parts of objects that were once larger. And so what happens is when most plastics are exposed to sunlight, they become weaker, and then the sort of shear and strain forces, the pulling and pushing and scraping in the ocean or on beaches makes them break up into smaller and smaller pieces. So we don't actually know how small they get, but we can say confidently that there's really no strong evidence that they will biodegrade or disappear on any meaningful time scale. And what that means is they'll accumulate. And they accumulate in the ocean, the floaters, where the surface ocean currents carry them. And so that's actually what the garbage patch consists of. That red heat map you see in the middle there is describing where mostly floating microplastics are collecting thanks to ocean currents.
And so is most plastic at the surface then? Where is it ending up?
Well, plastic really is found throughout the marine environment, from the surface to the seafloor, from the coasts to the very open ocean, from the poles to the tropics. The plastics have even been found frozen into sea ice, microplastics, and they're also in the atmosphere. We can't say for sure where most of the plastics are, for the same reason we can't easily say how much plastic is in the ocean. But you see these boxes in this sort of cartoon image, and this is showing sort of major parts of the marine environment where we know that plastics have been detected and can end up. Where they end up depends on the size and the type of the debris. So if you have a sort of big, heavy item, it'll sink really close to where it enters the ocean. But floating debris can travel great distances. Even some things that started out floating, like this plastic film, can end up sinking. And that's because organisms, biology, can settle on the items and cause those items to become dense enough to sink. So it really depends on the type of plastic and how long it's been in the environment. So plastics are also interacting with marine life. So if we're thinking about where in the ocean some of the plastic ends up, Some of it certainly is ending up in our marine animals, and how long it stays in there, again, depends on the plastic and the animal and its digestive system.
And we're going to talk more about potentially harmful effects in a minute. But my colleague, Ken Costell, is behind the scenes taking audience questions, and I understand we have some. So Ken, is there a question you'd like to share?
Yeah, this is sort of a double-barreled question that has, there are parallels here. Both of these come from Zoom. Dan asks, what's the most prevalent type of plastic in the ocean? And Lee is asking, and I'm going to paraphrase this, sort of what's the most common size of plastic piece in the ocean? Is it micro or macro, or is there some definition of that size fraction that's most common?
And when you say type of plastic, what do you mean there?
I think he means a particular
type.
formulation. Yeah, resin type. Thank you.
Okay. Kara, did you want to take that?
Sure, I can try to take a stab at those. So probably, okay, so in terms of the most prevalent sort of plastic material, we can only describe what we've measured, and at least floating at the sea surface, most of what we find is polyethylene and polypropylene. And these are the materials that are used. They're actually, if you look at the sort of number codes stamped on the bottom of your everyday products, those are the numbers 2, 4, and 5. So things like detergent bottles or milk jugs or dairy containers. And those are in fact plastics that float. And they're the most highly produced plastics, meaning in terms of the amount that is manufactured in a given year. And most or a significant fraction of that, about 35 to 40%, goes into packaging. So those items that are used for a short time and then become waste very quickly. The composition, though, is different if you're looking at the seafloor, because there are different types of plastics that are sinking. So I think the answer to the question of what's the most prevalent type is, well, where are you looking? And then the second one was, the most abundant type. So I think it's safe to say that if you're counting items, by far there are more probably nanoplastics. We don't actually have good methods to detect nanoplastics in the environment yet, but certainly by far there are more microplastics by count than larger items. But sometimes we want to know how much mass there is. And so you see this image of a big fishing net behind me. That is going to be a much greater mass than the microplastics in that same vicinity. So,
John, did you want to add anything, or Sarah?
No, I think that Kara's right, that the micro and nanoplastics are probably the most abundant particles in the ocean. Although, as she said, we really don't have a way to measure nanoplastics, which are in the nanometer size range. So as far as mass is concerned, it's hard to say.
So if I could add to that, Ronnie.
Please. Yep.
I mean, if one of the problems with, plastic's an amazing material, but one of the problems with it is that once it's discarded, and even during everyday use, it sheds small particles of itself. So the micro and the nanoplastics. And when you think about all of the larger pieces of plastic that have been dumped or lost to the environment, the destiny of every single large piece of plastic is eventually to break up and become smaller and smaller micro and nanoplastics. So we've got this huge potential debt, toxic debt sitting there with the continued release of micro and nanoplastics, about which we know with respect to their impacts very little so far.
And Sarah, I want to stay with you and talk a little bit about the recent Minderoo Monaco Commission report. It's more than 200 pages long. It's very comprehensive. But one aspect of it that really struck me was that it doesn't just focus on plastic waste in the environment, plastic pollution, but on actually the entire plastic life cycle. Maybe start by describing the life cycle of plastic, and then tell us why it was important to define the scope of the report that way.
Thank you. I'm just going to flip those round, if I may, because, okay, right, no, I will. I'll tell you about the life cycle. So the production really starts with the extraction of fossil fuels, so that's the coal, gas, and oil. And then what you need to do is crack, which equals split those complex source starting materials into smaller molecules to make the plastic. And this is very energy intensive with a lot of release of greenhouse gases and particulate matter. And the harms that we see are quite substantial at this stage. So, for example, fracking is linked to premature birth and childhood leukemia. The release of the particulate matter is linked to premature death and lung disease. Making plastic is linked to liver, breast, and lung cancer, as well as decreased fertility. And making synthetic textiles, we often don't think of fabrics as plastics, but they are, polyester and such like. That's linked, in the workers at least, to bladder and lung cancer. So the second phase is the everyday use. And it is incredibly useful, and you can see all those major markets there. Single use is the largest, 35 to 40%. And just try and live a day without it. But perhaps what's surprising to most of us is that the chemicals that I mentioned earlier that have to be added to the polymer to make the plastic, they're not strongly held within the plastic, and they leach out. And we found them in all sorts of human tissues, and blood, urine, amniotic fluid, cord blood. And then when you start looking at the health impacts, we see that there are links to decreased fertility, that's sperm quality, decreased birth weight, miscarriage, endometriosis, and male reproductive birth defects. And for children, we see loss of IQ points and some evidence for ADHD. Then in both children and adults, diabetes and obesity, as well as cardiovascular disease in adults. And so the last phase, and we split it into three, is actually the disposal. And what you can see is most of the arrows are sort of going from the left to the right. So it really is not a circular economy, it's a very linear one. And the disposal is really about controlled or uncontrolled either landfill or incineration. Some recycling, as I've said, only about 10%. And for single-use plastic, it's even worse. Only about 1% of single-use plastic is currently recycled. That's from another Minderoo report. And here in this last phase, we see cancers, leukemia, diabetes, and lung disease. And that's just to name a few. They are all documented in the report, but that gives you a snapshot.
From environmental exposures, from plastics. And
so that's right. So while you're extracting the fuel, well, for example, fracking uses thousands of chemicals which are injected into large volumes of water to push the oil and the gas out of the ground. And some of those are highly toxic, and they do leak. The water comes back up again, bringing the oil and gas with it. And then the contents of the fracking are stored in large tanks, but some of those leak, they get into the environment. And if you look at fracking sites and chart exposures in people living near fracking sites or indeed near petrochemical plants, we see increased concentrations in them and a higher incidence. For example, in Cancer Alley, where there are a lot of, in Mississippi, along the river, there's a place called, Cancer Alley. And the incidence of cancer in the people living in those communities is much higher than anywhere else. So
yeah, I think what I found really interesting about this diagram and this point of the report is, I think we're used to thinking about, plastic bags in the environment, or maybe straws or things that you might see, trash by the roadside or whatever. But we don't think as much, I think, about just the plastic we're exposed to as we're using it, but also the production phase. And I do think that's important. Going on with the report, tell us sort of some of the major, maybe summarize sort of at a high level what the major findings of the Commission's report were. Excuse me.
So I think, given the gargantuan numbers we've got, the first thing that we really wanted to emphasize is that the current production, use, and disposal of plastic is just not sustainable. I mean, and because plastic production is accelerating, all the harms we've described are going to get worse unless we have immediate action. And the second is, as we've just discussed, it's this whole concept of a whole life cycle approach and seeing harm from fossil fuel extraction onwards. And then the other thing I want to emphasize is that, okay, there's the visible pollution you can see with the plastic littering the environment, plus smokestacks and the such like out of petrochemical plants. But then there's the invisible chemicals, the chemicals in the plastic to which we're exposed during everyday use. And it wasn't until I got into this field that I realized how harmful that can be. This is a summary diagram from a review that was published earlier before the Minderoo Monaco Commission, and the ones in red are where we're seeing evidence, significant and consistent evidence for harm to human health. And it's all spelled out there in front of you. One of the really worrying things about this is that this high-level evidence comes for only a fraction of the chemicals that are used in plastic. We just don't really know what's in them. When you go and buy a packet of biscuits, you know what's in the biscuits, but you don't know what's in the plastic. So this diagram here was generated for one of the plasticizers called the phthalate plasticizers, the BPA, which is now being taken out of products, but is being replaced by something called BPS, which is very similar. Some of the flame retardants and some of the PFAS. So, and we're always behind the 8 ball. You know, we're having to do the research after the event, and we'd like to reverse the burden of, I think the more than that, the burden of proof needs to be reversed. So we know more about safety from the beginning and harm from the beginning.
Thank you, Sarah. John, I want to go to you. What's happening in the ocean then? How are plastics affecting marine life, and what kinds of exposures pose the greatest threat? Do we know?
Well, first, the effects of macroplastics, the large plastic particles, plastic bags, and things that you've seen pictures of. The effects of that plastic debris, they are obvious from disturbing images that most people have seen of turtles, birds, whales, and so on, strangled with skin lesions, and in many cases effectively starving because the guts are full of plastic. And internal lesions appear now in birds, in seabirds that are ingesting plastic in a condition called plasticosis. And what will it mean for the global ecosystem if 100% of seabirds are affected by plastics? As one example. Well, so that's with macroplastics, but I think that the greater concern is exposure to micro and nanoplastics that's more worrisome. And these are particles with sizes that are on the range of red blood cells to the size of viruses. The coronavirus, which you see an image of here, is in nanometers, 100 nanometers, and nanoplastic particles are of the similar size. And the effects of these have been determined largely thus far in experimental systems, experimental exposures using cells in culture or using, including human cells in many cases, or in animal models such as zebrafish, and in some invertebrates. Importantly, most of the experiments have been done using doses of plastic particles that are far greater than the concentrations observed in the ocean. So there's some inference about what might happen. Nevertheless, the experiments still do tell us what is possible, what could happen with exposure to these nano and microplastic particles. But that said, the effects of these particles seem to be converging on a few pathways: oxidative stress, immune system effects, metabolic disruption, that is, with the particles themselves. And there also are potential effects in ecosystems at the ecosystem level. In the midwaters, or what's known as the ocean twilight zone, in the deep ocean, on coral reefs, and so on. And there could be effects on the energy distribution in the ocean. You know, small organisms that are tiny crustaceans called copepods are really at the base of food chains. And while they do not consume plastics, as one shows in this video, which is from a colleague at WHOI, Husho Zhang, ideal, wonderful videography.
Yeah.
These these small animals filter the water, and this one is grabbing and pulling food in towards its mouth. When they're exposed to plastics, they don't actually do that. But if the plastics get a bacterial coating, which they invariably do, then they will consume these plastics, and the plastics that they consume can affect these animals, which may affect nutrition up the food chain. And these animals also excrete fecal pellets. Yes, that's right. And together with other organic matter, these form aggregates that are called marine snow. And you see here an image of what is known as marine snow, and that carries nutrients and nutrition down to the sea floor, but it also now is carrying plastics in many cases, which can contribute to effects in those remote regions on the seafloor. So it's a really complex set of problems that we face with plastic effects. It's not just the health of an individual, but it could be the health of the ecosystem.
Going back for just a second to that video of the copepod, so we can see little particles in the water there. So that's its food. It's the little algae and things that it's actually normally eating. But the problem is that the particles of plastic can actually be that small. And if they get covered with, you said biofilm, so if bacteria grows on them or whatever, then the copepod will think that's food. Is that essentially what's going on?
That's what's going on. Exactly. Yeah, you've got it.
Okay, so you mentioned that some of these organisms will eliminate the particles of plastic in their waste, but is that what always happens? And I'm thinking again of the really small particles, the ones that you said were the size of a blood cell or something like, really small virus. What happens to them when they get inside the digestive system of an organism? Where do they go in the fish or in the oyster?
Excellent question. That is the question. So many studies of plastics in fish in experiments, but also in fish sampled from the wild, show microplastic particles in the intestine or in the gut. And often those are just eliminated. And so you can find fish that contain a fair amount of plastic, but often that plastic is only within the lumen of the intestine. With the smallest particles, then they may pass through the cell wall and the tissue wall in the intestine and enter the bloodstream and be carried throughout the body, just like red blood cells. And how much gets into tissues in the brain, for example, is a critically important question.
Mm-hmm.
Also, how the particles may be handled within a cell or within a tissue. How are they altered, or what happens to them? Are they metabolized in any way? We know that the chemicals that are part of plastics, that is the chemicals that Sarah talked about, the additives, plasticizers, and so on, we know that those are metabolized by enzymes in the cell. And we know that the way in which they are eliminated, but the particles themselves may stay around, and what happens to them, we do not know. That unknown is one thing that really has to be addressed.
Both in marine life and in us, it sounds like, as well, from what Sarah was saying.
Absolutely right. So pretty much all plastic particles have these additives, as Sarah mentioned, as is shown here, but they also can adsorb, or pick up chemicals from the water. And you can see here pesticides, hydrocarbons, and even pathogens may be picked up by the particles. And now the particle is carrying not only the additive chemicals, but all of these other chemicals, and those are now getting into organisms. And as in humans, these additive chemicals and the many pollutants they pick up are known to cause neurodevelopmental disorders, cardiovascular effects, endocrine effects, and so on in fish and other organisms, as well as in humans. So it's a really serious issue. And the particles and the chemicals they carry are really part of a soup of chemicals, many of which have similar effects in neurodevelopmental problems. We know that they occur together in the environment, the plastics and all of these chemicals. What we do not know is what are the combined effects of the mixtures of the various chemicals plus now the particles. And so this is a major question in toxicology across the board.
Right, because it's not necessarily just additive, right? Those effects could actually compound one another and you end up with an even worse situation.
You have a potential compounding issue. And I think any action to curb plastics production or whatever should be considered in the context of and as part of efforts to understand and regulate persistent organic pollutants generally. And there is some effort to do that. There is discussion in the Stockholm Convention, which regulates an international agreement regarding regulation of persistent organic pollutants. There is discussion about how plastics might be included in what they consider.
All right, and we'll talk more about approaches to deal with some of these harmful effects in a minute, but I want to make sure we get some more audience questions in. So Ken, do we have anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, we have gotten about 70 questions and comments so far, and I was trying to decide between a couple of different lines of questioning, but a couple of people have asked about which fish in particular might be more susceptible to consuming plastics. That I guess that can be either species or level within the food chain. And then I have an interesting policy question after that for everyone.
All right, well, let's start with the which fish or which kinds of animals maybe are most susceptible to consuming plastics. I don't know who wants to take that one.
Well,
John,
I'll try initially, and then Kara can jump in, I think. I'm not sure which fish is most susceptible. I mean, there are different fish that have different feeding strategies, and the fish that feed on fish, which may have plastics in the gut, may be susceptible. It may be those that filter feed that are more susceptible for plastic accumulation on the gills, which may affect gas exchange in the same way that plastics or other particles in the lung may affect gas exchange for humans and other mammals. So it's an excellent question, and I think it's one that we should spend some time finding a good answer to.
And how about filter feeders like oysters and things like that?
They accumulate great quantities, as they do of chemicals generally, enough so that oysters and mussels were used for many years in a global program, started in the US, then became global, called Mussel Watch, which was a program that sampled bivalves, mussels and oysters and clams from around the world, measured chemicals in their tissues, and used that as a way of monitoring the exposure levels to bioavailable chemicals that would occur in different regions of the ocean. It's a really good question.
Can I pick up on that thread as well?
Yes.
I just wanted to add that it's really challenging to answer that question, because not only do we need to know what the response is when the animal encounters these materials or these chemicals, but we need to know what they're exposed to in the environment. And so when we still can't even measure nanoparticles and we don't know what kinds of chemicals might be contained, it's sort of detective work to try to figure out, even if you just collect these particles, even in a really easy way, like towing a plankton net at the sea surface, it's hard to figure out what's in them. And then you're trying to figure out what a particular animal or a particular species is exposed to in different parts of the ocean or in different parts of the world. So it's really a hard question, I think, to answer. And lots of people are thinking about these kind of biomonitoring applications like John was just describing, but it even gets a little bit more complicated. Some work out of Evan Ward's lab at University of Connecticut showed that some bivalves actually will selectively feed on different types of particles. So they may reject fibers, but take in spheres, right? So just even shape-based. So it unfortunately, microplastics and nanoplastics are such a complex and diverse category of particles. It makes it really challenging to make sort of broad generalizations.
Can I also add to that wherever we look, we find plastic. And so when we start looking in species, we find microplastics in the guts and larger pieces of many, many species. I think it's something like 1,200 fish species. and it's more than that. I mean, we've talked about the chemicals as well. And if you just take some of the plasticizers, they're found in all sorts of species: polar bears, narwhals, plankton, you name it. So if those chemicals, and we know they impact human health, so what are they doing to the health of these species as well? Is it impacting their reproductive health, their ability to feed, and the such like? So there are so many unknowns, but I really want to emphasize that just because we don't know everything yet does not mean we can't act.
I'd like to pick up on that, if I may, because Sarah mentioned the chemicals again. And looking at chemicals in the ocean or in freshwaters and chemical effects in marine and freshwater species has been going on for decades. There's an enormous wealth of information on toxicology and molecular and biochemical toxicology in fish and bivalves, birds, turtles, frogs, whatever, in marine mammals. And a lot of those chemicals we know are carried by plastics, not all of them. And so one question is, what is the greater source of these chemicals to animals? Is it the plastics that are picking up the chemicals and carrying them to the animals? And is that what has been responsible for the chemicals that have been looked at for decades being there in abundance in some individuals? Or is it that they're coming from other sources and plastic picking those up and carrying them is just one part of that greater source? It's a good question, and we don't have an answer to that. There are some suggestions that the plastics may be picking up great quantities of the chemicals in the water and delivering them, but there are other studies that suggest no, that's not the case. So it's an active area of research.
Ken, you said there was another question related to policy, I think?
Yeah, I'm going to save that for the end because we had another question come in the interim asking about another part of the environment, and that is sort of the coastal and in particular vegetation of like seagrass, and are plastics affecting those parts of the marine environment as well?
Sarah, maybe, or?
That's a good question. I think that there are scientists who are trying to ask those questions now. So in many of those environments with the seagrasses, we know that they are very effective traps for plastics. So we know that those could be areas that are sort of hot spots that collect the material that's been out there floating or maybe comes from shore. And there are some scientists who've been looking at the impacts on plants who are encountering plastics. Does this affect their ability to photosynthesize? Does it increase or decrease production? So I think those are really earlier stage lines of research at this point. I don't know that we have any concrete answers, but people really, it's in the time that I've been working on this problem, it's been really interesting to just watch the evolution of, first looking at what's floating and in fish, and then it's evolved to sort of every part of the living biosphere, right? Not just in the ocean, but asking about freshwater, asking about terrestrial organisms, what's happening with the plastic films that are spread on our agricultural fields and over the crops that we're growing to eat. So I think the questions have grown really quickly as we start to realize how pervasive the plastics are really over the whole planet.
The effects on plants goes beyond the seagrass, of course. Phytoplankton in the ocean, micro and nano picoplankton, very small, responsible for a vast amount of the oxygen production on the planet. And plastic particles are being studied for their effects on phytoplankton and on oxygen generation. And here again, there are different results obtained. But one of the important things is that it's stuff that leaches from the plastics that seems to be able to affect the success of phytoplankton and photosynthesis and by the phytoplankton.
So we've been talking about the fate of plastics in the environment and the associated chemicals and some of the many problems that they're causing. At the same time, we humans have come to rely pretty heavily on plastics. They're a component of almost everything around us, and they have many beneficial applications. The report, though, paints a pretty dire picture of the harm that they're causing to both people and the environment throughout their life cycle. Kara, can you give us a little hope here? What can we do to keep the benefits, but at the same time reduce the harms that we've been talking about?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and I think the good news is that the world is paying attention. Again, sort of along with the increased scientific research, we've seen increased public concern and attention at all levels to how are we going to fix this problem. So I can say that many actions are planned or are already occurring really along the entire life cycle of plastics. This is sort of a different way to look at that, from interventions that might occur from starting with reducing production to just sort of necessary production, but also innovations in the designs of products or the materials that we use, changing how we use the plastics to potentially make less waste, and improving how we manage them at their end of life. And also recognizing that we're human. We're going to always have something to clean up in the environment, no matter how perfect we are along all those sort of chains further up on the link. But I think probably everybody would agree that we could use plastics more responsibly. We could choose to use them when we need them. Many medical applications, we're not going to try to give up our plastics. But really we can avoid them when they're not necessary. And so there are roles for all of us as consumers. We can choose to purchase items or not. We can choose to carry reusable items. But there's also a lot of legislation happening to try to charge for or ban items that are deemed unnecessary, things like single-use plastic bags or straws. But then there are also many, many scientists working to try to improve waste management and recycling systems, and also practitioners. So figuring out how to better sort our waste so that we can actually capture and recycle more of it. And even brand owners are making changes. Folks may or may not have noticed that the Sprite bottle, the iconic green Sprite bottle, has recently become clear. And that's because the Coca-Cola company has recognized that a clear bottle is more readily recyclable than a green one. And I'm in no way endorsing Coca-Cola products, but just as a point that really there are roles for everyone, from each of us as individuals in society to producers and to brand owners, from our local municipalities to our states and national laws, and also international agreements are playing a role now. So we're looking at all levels. And I'm not sure if folks are aware, but 1 year ago, and maybe a month plus a month, at the United Nations Environment Assembly, UN member states passed a resolution to establish a legally binding international agreement to address global plastic pollution. And that negotiation process is underway right now. The next meeting will be occurring next month in Paris. And there are strong calls throughout this process from many different stakeholders that the agreement be have actions that are based on scientific evidence, so that we're not ending up putting in place false solutions or solutions with unintended consequences. And in fact, this is really the setting in which our report was published, was towards an eye to inform this process with what we know scientifically. And so maybe Sarah would like to talk a little bit more about the treaty and how the report was trying to inform that.
Yeah, thanks, Cara. I mean, you will just heard some wonderful enthusiasm and optimism from Cara, and I think we all feel that. I think we know what to do. We've just got to do it. And this is a gargantuan problem. It's a global problem. It's going to need a global solution. And one of the things we haven't really emphasized is the fact that the global south, the countries that are the low and middle income and the poorest, that don't produce the plastic in the first place, are suffering some of the worst consequences. So we really do need to work together. And the resolution was actually passed unanimously. Something like 180 countries signed it. And here is the sculpture of this amazing plastic tap. And that speaks to the very first top priority from our commission. And that is to really get to the source of the problem and turn off the tap on virgin plastic. Not turn it off completely. It is very useful, but we do have to stem the tide. So we are calling for a cap on global plastic production, and we think that part of this will most certainly need to be a levy, because at the moment, all of the costs, the harms, are actually externalized, and what's paying for those costs is environmental health and human health. So we need to get to the source of the problem. The other thing is to really think about banning and severely restricting those unnecessary and avoidable plastics, that 30 to 40%, which I think is very low hanging
The
fruit.
single-use kind of
Yeah,
plastics.
single use. I mean, to use something once and throw it away, it's crazy. And coupled with that, it's very it's convenient from the point of view of the immediate use, but it's not convenient from the amount of mess we have to clear up. But we really need to use money from that levy to seriously invest in alternate materials which don't contain plastic chemicals and which don't break up and up and up and up, you know, into these smaller and smaller pieces themselves. So, and then I think the other third thing that we've got to do is really look at the chemical components of plastic, because that's the sort of silent, you know, it's a sort of elephant in the room. They're there, and we really need to highlight them. We've done that in this report. And we need protective standards. So we need to know what's in our plastic. You know, when you buy a packet of biscuits or something from the supermarket, you know what's in the food, but you have no idea what's in the plastic. And we now know that chemicals leach out of food packaging and they get into the food. There's a substantial, huge amount of evidence on that. And the other thing is that we need there's no mechanism in place to monitor the harm. At the moment, it's up to researchers to find out the exposure, you know, measure people's blood and urine, and then link that to the health effect long after the exposure has happened. So we need to know what's in the plastic and then have some kind of mechanism, much like the pharmaceutical industry does for drugs, for medicines that we willingly and knowingly put in our mouths or have injected into us. But with all the plastic chemicals and the micro and nanoplastics, that's unknowingly, you know, we didn't ask them to be in us, but they're in us and they are causing harm. So we need
more transparency, more information.
More transparency and more monitoring, because the sort of tests that are done before release are in the lab and they simply don't replicate the long lifespan of the human being of chronic diseases. And we haven't even started looking at things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's yet, although we are at Minderoo. And also the fact that often those diseases are very complex. So we really do need transparency. That's right. What's in the plastic and then what's in us and how is that linked to harm? So
John, sorry.
Sorry,
apologies. Yep. It's hard to tell without being able to see you. Apologies. John, I just wanted to make sure we also talked about the ocean in this context. So from your perspective as an ocean scientist and a toxicologist, is there anything you wanted to add?
Well, I think we've heard an awful lot of really interesting stuff tonight, and I've been looking at the questions in the Q&A. A lot of wonderful questions, great questions.
We will get more, I promise.
I encourage these people to go look at the report. Anyway, regarding chemicals and plastics, people may not know that that harm coming from chemicals and plastics goes back to observations made in the early 1970s about phthalates, one of the plasticizers, leaching from intravenous tubing in hospitals or from plastic petri dishes that affected the growth of cells in experiments. And so that understanding that there are things in plastic that cause this harm goes back a long way. And the amount of plastics in the ocean, as you've heard, and I'll repeat, it predicted to double or so by 2030 and again by 2050. And I can say that if there is no change, the problems are absolutely going to get worse. And as a toxicologist, I am concerned about how organisms and ecosystems are going to respond to this. How will they respond to this increased mass? And are we just on the edge of ecosystem problems that we haven't yet seen? So how serious are the problems? Well, to summarize, we know that the obvious ones, that debris causes harm, including death to large animals, turtles, birds, and so on. But for the potentially more harmful micro and especially nanoplastics, as you've heard, we don't yet know. It is important to gain knowledge to assess how these small plastics are really affecting ocean life and humans, and perhaps find ways to intervene. And I want to say that in 1962, Rachel Carson, who wrote and worked for a long time in Woods Hole, here's a statue of her in Woods Hole. She published Silent Spring, and that sounded the alarm that really sparked the whole environmental movement.
About pesticides.
The alarm has been sounded about plastics and about persistent chemicals in the oceans. So the need now is for a course of action to protect the oceans and all they give us, which is a lot, without which we wouldn't survive. And so the time really is now for a really strong UN treaty, as you've heard Kara talk about and Sarah talk about, and to reduce the use and alter the production of plastics in a way that we can retain all of what plastics do give us, and yet protect the essential values of the oceans, the ocean health and human health. There's a lot to do.
Thanks for that, John. I do want to take, I know we're almost out of time here, but I do want to take at least one or two more audience questions. So Ken, what do you got for us?
Let's see, a couple of people have noted that they have heard that there are some microorganisms that eat plastics, and I was wondering if panelists could comment on those. Is this something that they have evolved to do over this relatively short period of time, or are they just
The organisms
naturally
that intentionally eat plastic.
that are capable
microbes
of, microbes.
I can comment on one study that is probably linked to that question. So there was a group in Japan that identified microbes in a PET bottling recycling plant. So like soft drink and water bottles are made of PET material, and these microbes had evolved presumably to be able to use that plastic as their sole food source, because there was nothing else there. But they did find they were able to fully biodegrade that material to break it down, but it was happening at very, very slow rates. And so now there are people who are trying to do some bioengineering to understand those enzymes and try to actually create ways to break down those PET bottles or that PET material a little bit faster. But I should say that PET bottles are actually one of the most recycled items of plastic. So we shouldn't try to put all of our hopes on the Japanese microbe necessarily, but it did open up a really important line of research.
Interesting. Another question, Ken?
Okay, I know that the panelists are scientists, but if you could remove macroplastics from the ocean or microplastics from the ocean, which would you suggest more investment be given to, or which would you just magically remove?
Magic is one way that I don't think we're going to have. So thinking realistically, you can't really filter the ocean for microplastics. So removing macroplastics, from which microplastics come, at least many of them, would be a starting point.
And I would just stop them from going in the first place.
Yeah.
That's where I put my money.
Yeah, so we did have a question about are there things being done that are effective, presumably, to keep plastics from entering waterways and coastal waters?
I'm happy to respond, but I don't want to take any back. Talk to
Sure, go ahead. And this might have to be our last question, I'm afraid. So go ahead, Kara.
There are people working on ways to trap litter in waterways, and even upstream by putting filters on washing machines to collect those clothing fibers when they come off in the wash. But you know, that cleanup is pretty far down the list. I think we need to target our efforts even farther upstream.
It's an important question for freshwaters as well, because we drink fresh water and there are certainly plastics in fresh waters, as some have questioned in the chat and the Q&A. We haven't addressed that, but it's an issue.
All right. I'm just gonna give Sarah one chance to say a last word here, but hopefully on a relatively positive note.
Yeah.
Sarah, are you optimistic that we can actually, keep the benefits but vastly reduce the harms?
Yes, I do. And we're all in this together. I think one of the partners that we really haven't talked to much are the fossil fuel producers and the plastics producers. We've got to get them to the table and work together on this. And when you think about it, all of us live on this tiny, small blue planet, 70% ocean. We're critically dependent on the environment for our health, our survival, and yet we're trashing it within an inch of its life. So we can do this. Put it this way, we must do it. We have to do it. And I know we can, working together.
And I'm confident we can. I know that actually here at WHOI, we have scientists working with industry partners to try to improve the formulations of plastics and things along those lines. So I will remain optimistic with you. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for tonight. I want to say a big thank you to Sarah Dunlop, Kara Lavender Law, and John Stegeman for joining us to talk about plastics and plastics in the ocean. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great to speak with you. Thank you also to all my WHOI colleagues, Ken and everyone else who's been working very hard behind the scenes to make this event possible. And to all of you who joined us on Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube, thank you. Tonight's event was the third in our 5th season of WHOI's Ocean Encounters events. Please join us again in May for our next Ocean Encounters. We'll be talking about robots, their growing role in ocean research, and how they're helping us find solutions to some of our greatest challenges. Please watch our website, whoi.edu, for more information about that. In the meantime, you might want to also take a look at the very cool merchandise at WHOI's online store. That's shop.whoi.edu. You get a 15% event discount for joining us tonight. Just type in the discount code PLASTICS. If you enjoyed tonight's Ocean Encounters program, you can be part of WHOI's solution-based approach to ocean science. If you're already a WHOI member, thank you very much. If not, please consider joining. You'll be providing crucial support for our outreach and our not sure what just happened there, but you'll get some great benefits in return if you join us as a member. Memberships start at just $40 a year. The average gift is $120, but any amount helps. Your support will make a difference. I also just want to take a second to mention that WHOI has 2 videos in the running for this year's People's Telly Awards. The awards showcase the best work created for television and across video for all screens, as chosen by you, the audience. Voting is now open, and we'd love to have you watch our videos and rate our entries. Hopefully you'll agree that they're worthy of 5 stars. We're putting those links to the videos in the chat, and they're on the slide there, go.whoi.edu/vote1 and /vote2. Voting ends on April 21st, so please be sure to submit your vote before then. On behalf of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, thank you and good night.
Out where the seas are the deepest and the mysteries the greatest lies our future. The ocean is our last unexplored, ungoverned frontier. The life support system for our planet, inextricably linked to our climate and weather, and to the lives and livelihoods of countless people around the globe. But even against the ocean's vastness, humankind can be a formidable force. What happens next demands action that is rooted in scientific understanding and unvarnished truth, because our world stands at a fork in the road. In one direction, we watch the ocean being catastrophically altered beyond its ability to sustain us. In the other, understanding outraces exploitation, and we help steward and protect this most precious shared resource. What will be the legacy of the 21st century? Together, we can unleash the world's most creative minds, passionately dedicated to ocean science, engineering, education, and policy. Together, We can provide the expertise needed to know what works and a trusted voice to present the facts as we uncover them. Together, we can shape the future. We can inform governments, businesses, and conservationists. We can generate new knowledge in service of society. We can be the catalyst for change. It is more than our responsibility. It is the defining moment of our generation. We are explorers, students, and stewards of the ocean, and this is our time.